This is Mr. P here. I just want to highlight a few stories from the intersection of being queer and Black in the 1960s through the 80s, 90s, really. And so I just want to highlight a few histories, a few points about this particular intersection. It's something that we've highlighted from time to time throughout the year. We've talked about, for example, Bayard Rustin's role in the civil rights movement, and his positionality as a queer Black man in that movement. But here I want to focus entirely on this intersection. So let's present and get to it. This is a great mural paying homage to Stonewall, particularly to Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who we will talk about in just a moment. But, Sylvia Rivera has a great quote here. "I was a radical, a revolutionist. I'm still a revolutionist. I'm glad I was in the Stonewall riot. I remember when someone Molotov cocktail, I thought, my God, the revolution is here. The revolution is finally here." And so Sylvia Rivera was a trans woman, Latina trans woman who was at the Stonewall riots, and they were an uprising that traditionally is noted as the start of the modern gay and liberation movement. Obviously, there have been LGBTQ folks from the dawn of time, of humanity, and there's a long history there, some of which is recorded and much of which is not always recorded. But in terms of the modern gay and lesbian liberation movement, trans liberation, folks typically trace it back to Stonewall, where there was a gay bar here in New York City, mostly catering to poor young gay folks and to trans folks. Who both groups were often rejected from gay bars in New York that catered to more middle class, bourgeois folks, cisgendered folks. So the police raided many of these bars. They targeted Stonewall this night, and they arrested 13 folks. They targeted these bars under the pretext that it was because they had liquor licenses that weren't official. Well, the reason why, or that they did not have liquor licenses at all. Well, the reason why they didn't have liquor licenses is because the state discriminated against gay-owned bars and didn't give them liquor licenses and wouldn't allow them to apply. And so you end up with a situation where they have to turn to, the mafia to supply them or whatever the case may be. Well, at this particular incident, LGBTQ folks fought back, and they threw Molotov cocktails, as we saw Sylvia Rivera talk about. And this led to the annual marches for LGBTQ rights. Eventually, these became known as Pride marches. They were first the Christopher Street Parade. That's where the Stonewall Inn is, and then they become the Pride marches we know and love today. I do want to note, though, that the Stonewall Uprising is by no means the start of LGBTQ folks fighting back. It's just kind of, seen traditionally as the modern start. But even in the modern era, you have, trans women and drag queens and folks fighting back against police brutality at the Compton cafeteria riots in San Francisco. There was a high degree of police brutality, particularly among trans folks. And folks who may have cross-dressed or, who were drag queens. Under the trans umbrella, there's a range of identities, so that's why I'm kind of identifying different groups here. And that's because it was considered a crime for someone who the police identified as, let's say the police would identify someone as male, and that person was dressed in a way that they were presenting as femme. That was criminalized. And so folks were criminalized. Trans women were criminalized if they were visible and identified. And so this is, so the folks fought back at various points. So I just want to highlight that. Marsha B. Johnson, featured here, was also at the Stonewall uprising, which was obviously an interracial uprising. Marsha P. Johnson always said that the P stood for pay it no mind. That's something she was noted for. She was a beloved member of the trans community, of the LGBTQ community in general, someone who brought a lot of joy to various spaces. She was an activist. She was a drag performer. She was also a prostitute. Many trans folks were prostitutes because in some cases, they were often kicked out of their homes, were unable to get employed at spaces that would not employ trans folks. So there was a disproportionate number of trans women in particular in sex work. She co-founded STAR, to house an organization that housed, clothed, fed, and advocated for trans people in New York City. She's originally from Philly. She moved to New York. She was also a model for Andy Warhol, the super famous artist. You can read her obituary here. And she also, she was found in the Hudson River, had drowned from what was undetermined causes. It was initially ruled a suicide, but folks fought back and said this was clearly a murder, and it's the drowning from undetermined causes is the official designation today, and it remains and was opened back up as an open case. There's a documentary on Netflix that follows Victoria Cruz, a trans woman, Victoria Cruz, I believe that's her name. She's been doing a lot of work trying to investigate this case because the police for a while were not, but they opened it back up. The Combahee River Collective is another organization formed during the 70s that was a collective of Black women, but many of these women were lesbians, and so the Combahee River Collective is an important part of intersectional Black queer history. They put forward an analysis of interlocking oppressions, what we call intersectionality today. And this is tied to capitalist exploitation. They develop a vision for building coalitions across different issues to work together to reorganize American society for a liberatory vision. This is from their statement, which you can read fully here. They actively are committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression. They understand that these systems interlock. For example, there was a legal case at the same time as they're drafting this statement in 1976-77, where Black women sued General Motors. Yeah, it was General Motors for discriminating against them. Because even when they were, a few of them were hired in the 60s, they, after a recession, they all were the first to lose their jobs. And prior to a certain date in the 60s, no Black women were hired. They lost their case because the legal system under the Civil Rights Act understood that there is employment discrimination based on race and there's employment discrimination based on sex. They did not envision these intersectionally, which means General Motors claimed, we hire men, worked on the factories, Black men included, worked on the factories. Therefore, no race-based claim, right? Black men are hired. We hire women, they said, right? And white women were hired as secretaries. But for many years, they did not hire any Black women. Black men and white women were hired, but no Black women. Therefore, it was necessary to have an understanding of interlocking oppression. Racism and classes and sexism impacted Black women in a way in particular, but the legal system, for example, did not have this analysis. And therefore, Combahee River Collective put forward this analysis, and later Kimberly Crenshaw, a lawyer, put forward this analysis, tying it explicitly to the legal system. And many of these women fought in the civil rights movements. They fought in the Black Power movements. They fought in the women's liberation movements, in the gay liberation movements. But they often felt on the periphery, and therefore the Combahee River Collective served as a political home for many of them. And therefore, even when they weren't doing political work together, they were meeting to develop solidarity within their space and to make sure that they had a supportive network. They considered themselves socialists, fighting for the collective benefit of the workers and not for the profit of the bosses. And they believed in a collective, non-hierarchical process of organizing, self-criticism, and they believed that their politics did not always they did not believe that the end always justified the means, which meant the way they fought for liberation to also be liberatory. They also for issues that the women's liberation movement wasn't fighting for. For example, the women's liberation movement in the 70s fought for abortion rights, but many Black women having been forced sterilized. And so they didn't even have the option for abortion because they didn't even have the option to be to have a child, to be pregnant. And so they fought against this kind of forced sterilization, which has its history going back to eugenics. And all the way up through the 70s in places around the country, especially in Virginia, North Carolina, women, not just Black women, poor women, women with disabilities, with mental illness, were forced sterilized. And there was a lot of Black and Puerto Rican women who were sterilized. Moving into the kind of more cultural space here, so out of this intersection of queer communities of color emerges ball culture. While this kind of ball culture began in the 20s with mostly white drag queens performing, some Black queens were allowed to join, but there was a lot of racism. They were asked to lighten their faces, things like that. Therefore, by the 70s, you have LGBTQ folks of color mostly, with some white folks joining, building their own ball culture, their own ballroom spaces where they would, performers would compete or walk for trophies, for glory at the balls. Categories included a variety of categories within the LGBTQ community. Out of this comes, voguing, which becomes mainstreamed by Madonna in the 90s. And so the idea here, there's two aspects to this that I want to highlight. House culture. These folks are forming their own houses because they have to choose their own families because many were kicked out of their homes. And the balls, where they walked, was a space to claim a space for oneself, because in the world beyond those balls, there was not a lot of acceptance, let alone affirmation, for queer folks of color. And so many would, try and embody what they couldn't have. So you have categories like executive realness, right? Folks embodying that executive corporate world that they were not having access to. And so this was around creating space to affirm one another. There were issues, of course. There was, trans women in these spaces were treated differently and fought for more recognition. There were, things like that. But obviously, this was a space that queer folks of color built for themselves. So I recommend Paris is Burning, that documentary. I also recommend Pose, which bases its stories in this history, TV series out there. Finally, Audre Lorde is going to be the topic of our seminar discussion. I highly recommend that you listen to the podcast that I posted on Classroom, as well as read her speech on the uses of called The Uses of Anger, Women Responding to Racism. You can find the full speech on blackpast.org. Audre Lorde was, as she identified, a Black lesbian feminist warrior poet, mother of two, right? Identifying her space, herself as at the intersection of many identities that interlocked to create a particular experience for her. She grew up in a daughter of immigrant parents from the Caribbean, attended mostly white schools, often felt on the outside of many spaces she was in, redefined marriage. She married a man who was gay, but they had children together because they wanted to raise children together, but they had an open relationship. And, she had mostly been with women before, he had mostly been with men, but they redefined what that could look like. And they eventually divorced, and she co-parented with another woman, Frances Clayton, for much of the rest of her life. And so, she lived openly as a lesbian for much of her life, and that affected her view of the world, of course. And so she gives a speech called The Uses of Anger at a conference for a women's studies conference in 1981. And that's what we will read for a seminar discussion. It's a great speech that is delivered to mostly white women in academia, and she's urging them to listen to the anger of women of color. And she urges women of color to listen to each other's anger. And she urges all women to listen to each other's anger, because anger is something that, in a patriarchal world, men have often been permitted to exhibit, and women have often been told it's a negative quality. But she highlights that when one is angry at oppression and racism in particular, or any oppression, that anger is filled with information, it's filled with energy, and it can be used and directed towards liberation. And so it's really a speech that is a call to listen, and it's a call to validate and affirm one's anger at injustice in the world. And so I'm really looking forward to our discussion together. It's a beautiful speech, a beautiful piece of writing. And so I'm really looking forward to diving into it with you all. I also recommend her biography, Warrior Poet, and